Steven Seagal wasn't just an action star, he was a whole phenomenon. From snapping bones on screen to dropping Zen-like wisdom, he built a reputation as Hollywood's tough guy with a spiritual edge. But behind the ponytail and martial arts swagger, there were strange things happening, things most of us either overlooked or chose to ignore. His career, his personal quirks, even the way he carried himself, none of it was as simple as it seemed. So what were these bizarre details hiding in plain sight? Let's dig into the controversial world of Steven Seagal. Many call Steven Seagal a liar. During the golden age of martial arts action flicks in the 1980s and 1990s, audiences couldn't get enough of high-flying kicks, brutal punches, and endless gunfights. It was the era of muscle-bound heroes and stoic fighters. And out of that frenzy emerged Steven Seagal. Unlike the other stars who relied on karate chops or roundhouse kicks, Seagal brought something different to the table. His weapon of choice was Aikido, a Japanese martial art built not on brute force, but on redirection, throws, and using your enemy's momentum against them. It gave his movies a unique flavor, which was less about charging into fights, and more about effortlessly dismantling opponents as if he were untouchable. And that was exactly the image he cultivated. On screen, Seagal liked to present himself as the ultimate calm, collected badass. He carried himself with the aura of a wise sensei, soft-spoken, mysterious, and seemingly indestructible. To fans, he wasn't just another action hero. He was the martial arts mystic with a ponytail and a death stare. But peel back that carefully crafted facade, and things start to look very different. Because behind the cool exterior was a man drowning in controversies, accusations of dishonesty, endless tall tales, harassment scandals, and even shady international dealings that sounded like something straight out of a spy thriller. One of the biggest cracks in Seagal's armor was his messy relationship with the truth. Over the years, countless people have accused him of being a compulsive liar, bending reality until it snapped just to make himself seem larger than life. And these weren't just whispers on movie sets. The accusations followed him into court. In 2003, a Brooklyn courtroom found itself caught up in Seagal's tangled reputation. Defense attorney George Santangelo was representing mobsters Anthony Ciccone and Primo Casarino, who were accused of extorting Seagal for hundreds of thousands of dollars. The FBI was involved, the press was circling, and Seagal's credibility, or lack of it, became a major piece of the case. The defense painted him as such a notorious liar that his stories couldn't be trusted. And it wasn't just courtroom drama, industry insiders backed it up. Canadian filmmaker Damien Lee told the New York Post that Seagal was flat-out delusional, adding that with him, no one could ever tell where the truth ended and the fantasy began. And the embellishments weren't limited to Hollywood gossip or mob trials. They reached all the way into his family life. Seagal built a public persona that leaned heavily on stories from his childhood. Tales of being a tough street kid growing up in Brooklyn, scraping his way through rough neighborhoods. But according to People magazine, even his own mother wasn't buying it. Pat Seagal remembered her son very differently. She remembered him as a frail, asthmatic little boy who left Michigan at age 5 and grew up in California. Not the Brooklyn bruiser he liked to portray. Then there's his martial arts legend. For years, Seagal claimed that he had trained directly under Morihei Ueshiba, the revered founder of Aikido himself. It was the kind of claim that added instant mystique, giving him almost mythical credibility. But the timeline didn't line up. Ueshiba passed away in 1969 when Seagal was just a teenager. Martial arts figures who had actually trained under Ueshiba, like black belt Terry Dobson, publicly called Seagal's claim nonsense. Dobson dismissed it bluntly, saying he'd never even heard of Seagal in that circle, and flat-out declared that story is bull. For Seagal, blurring fact and fiction wasn't just a bad habit. It became a signature move. He wasn't only playing a role in front of cameras, he was scripting his life story off-screen, layering myth on top of myth until the truth was almost impossible to find. And when people tried to peel those layers back, Seagal didn't exactly handle it with grace. To hear others tell it, he couldn't stomach criticism, no matter how small. Seagal allegedly tried to set up blackmail and assassinations. In 1991, GQ magazine ran a profile on Seagal written by Alan Richman, and it wasn't the glowing tribute Seagal expected. Instead of bowing to his mystical sensei persona, Richman portrayed him as arrogant and temperamental. Seagal, of course, lashed out on national TV, showing up on Arsenio Hall's talk show to fire back. He mocked Richman with personal insults, even calling him a 5'2" fat little male impersonator. The problem? Richman was actually 5'9" and a former Army captain. Responding with his own dose of sarcasm, Richman said he hadn't meant to offend, but could easily have been much harsher if he'd wanted to be. But according to insiders, Seagal wasn't satisfied with just throwing insults on late-night TV. Behind the scenes, things allegedly took a darker turn. An unnamed security consultant later told Spy magazine that Seagal approached him with two disturbing requests. First, he allegedly wanted Richman blackmailed. The supposed plan was to lure the journalist into a compromising situation, set him up with a male lover, secretly photograph the encounter, and then use the images to ruin his reputation. The consultant, disgusted by the request, refused, and it didn't stop there. During the same conversation, Seagal allegedly went even further, asking whether the consultant could arrange a hit on a man from Chicago. The details were vague. No specific name was given, but the implication was chilling. It sounded less like a targeted hit job and more like a broad threat aimed at anyone who dared cross him. Again, the consultant refused, but the story painted a troubling picture. This wasn't just an actor with a bruised ego. This was someone who, at least according to those around him, let his grudges spiral into dangerous territory. For fans who only knew Seagal as the calm, untouchable sensei on screen, these stories were jarring. The man who built a career on preaching discipline, control, and honor seemed to be living a double life, where the lessons of martial arts were twisted into something much darker. And it wouldn't be the last time talks about Seagal's vindictive streak surfaced. But Seagal's temper wasn't the only part of his private life raising eyebrows. His love life was just as messy, if not more. His marriages were a mess. Like many Hollywood stars, Seagal has a trail of marriages behind him, 4 in total. His first came in 1975 when he married Miyako Fujitani, a Japanese Aikido instructor whose family ran a respected dojo in Osaka. On the surface, it looked like a natural fit, the young martial artist tying himself to Japan and its traditions. But according to Spy magazine, there were rumors that Seagal's marriage to a Japanese national was more than just romance. It may have been a convenient way to avoid the military draft during the Vietnam War. For a while, things seemed steady. Seagal taught at Fujitani's dojo and built up his skills in Japan. But in 1980, he left the country with a solemn promise never to betray her. That promise didn't last. Just 4 years later, while still married to Fujitani, Seagal married actress Adrienne LaRussa. In other words, he was neck-deep in bigamy before his Hollywood career had even fully taken off. And that wasn't the end of the drama. Around the same time, Seagal became infatuated with Kelly LeBrock, the model-turned-actress who had just lit up screens in The Woman in Red. By all accounts, Seagal pursued her hard. Some suggested the relationship was less about passion and more about strategy, that he saw LeBrock's rising fame as a way to boost his own credibility in Hollywood. Whatever the motive, the affair was intense, and it didn't take long before LeBrock was pregnant. The fallout was swift. Fujitani, his first wife, finally granted him a divorce, and LaRussa sought an annulment after realizing she had been duped into a sham marriage. LaRussa later claimed she never asked Seagal for money during their split. In fact, she alleged the opposite, that she actually gave him cash for months just to make him go away. By 1987, Seagal had married LeBrock, and for a while it seemed like Hollywood's newest action star had settled down. The couple had 3 children together, but behind closed doors, the marriage was turbulent. By 1994, LeBrock had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Years later, she would openly describe her relationship with Seagal as a nightmare, painting a picture of a marriage riddled with control issues and emotional strain. Seagal didn't exactly spend years reflecting in solitude. In 2009, he tied the knot again, this time with Erdenatuya El Batsuk, a Mongolian-born dancer who had first worked as his assistant. The two have a son together, and unlike his earlier marriages, this one has stayed relatively low-key. Still, given Seagal's track record, the quietness of his current marriage stands in stark contrast to the chaos of the ones that came before. From allegations of draft dodging to bigamy, torrid affairs, and explosive divorces, Seagal's love life was anything but serene. It mirrored his public image perfectly, a man who always wanted to appear disciplined and in control, yet whose private choices told a story of power, recklessness, ego, and messy betrayals. And speaking of power, few parts of Seagal's life raise eyebrows more than his very public bromance with Vladimir Putin. Seagal has a long-standing relationship with Vladimir Putin. Seagal isn't just friendly with the Russian president, he's one of his loudest cheerleaders. He's praised Putin on multiple occasions, once describing him as one of the great living world leaders, and even going as far as saying he'd like to consider him a brother. For a Hollywood star who built his brand on American action flicks, this allegiance was both surprising and controversial. And it didn't stop at words. In 2012, when much of the world condemned Russia's occupation of Crimea, Seagal backed it. He vocally defended Putin's policies, aligning himself not just with the man, but with his most contentious geopolitical moves. By 2013, Putin himself floated the idea of making Seagal a Russian consul and intermediary between Moscow and Washington. The suggestion was met with disbelief in Washington, with one Obama administration official reportedly telling BuzzFeed, "You've got to be kidding." But Putin wasn't kidding, and neither was Seagal. By 2016, Seagal was officially granted Russian citizenship. 2 years later, Putin appointed him as a special envoy to improve U.S.-Russia relations. To many, the announcement felt surreal, like a B-list action movie plot had spilt over into real-world politics. But to Putin, Seagal wasn't just a movie star with fading relevance. He was a useful cultural tool, someone who could legitimize Russia's image abroad. The bond between them has only deepened. In 2023, Putin awarded Seagal the Order of Friendship Medal, honoring him for his loyalty and his support of Russia's actions in Ukraine. The gesture cemented Seagal not just as a fan of Putin, but as a decorated ally. And Putin isn't the only controversial leader Seagal has cozied up to. In 2017, he turned up in the Philippines for a photo op with President Rodrigo Duterte. True to form, Seagal praised Duterte's leadership, despite the international outcry over Duterte's brutal war on drugs, which left thousands dead. To critics, these friendships weren't random photo opportunities. They were proof of Seagal's willingness to align himself with strong men and authoritarian figures, even as his Hollywood career dwindled. But Seagal's questionable choices weren't limited to politics. Even in comedy, he managed to leave a trail of disaster, and nowhere was that more obvious than his infamous stint on Saturday Night Live. Seagal was awful on SNL. For Hollywood stars, hosting SNL is almost a badge of honor. It's a chance to show audiences a lighter, funnier side, to prove they can laugh at themselves. But when Seagal took the stage in Season 16, Episode 18, the results were catastrophic. From the jump, it seemed doomed. Just months earlier, during a 1991 appearance on the Arsenio Hall show, Seagal openly admitted he wasn't thrilled about doing sketch comedy. He didn't have the timing, the humility, or, frankly, the self-awareness. And when the big night came, the cast and crew quickly realized they had a problem on their hands. Writers and performers who were there later recalled Seagal as not just difficult, but the worst host in SNL history. Longtime writer and future U.S. Senator Al Franken didn't hold back when describing the ordeal. Speaking on the Your Mom's House podcast, he explained that Seagal didn't understand comedy and had no interest in playing along. One sketch Seagal pitched involved a psychologist hypnotizing a woman and then sexually assaulting her. To the writers, it wasn't just unfunny, it was flat-out disturbing. Franken summed it up bluntly. Out of all the hosts SNL had ever seen, Seagal was the worst by a mile. The disaster became such a running joke within SNL that even Lorne Michaels, the show's creator, couldn't resist taking a jab. About a year and a half later, when Nicolas Cage hosted the season 18 premiere, his opening monologue had him making a string of tasteless comments about his female co-stars. Michaels walked on stage to give him a mock lecture about boundaries. Cage, playing along, pretended to panic that he'd just become the worst host of all time. Michaels reassured him with a deadpan punchline. No, that would be Steven Seagal. The audience roared, but not everyone was laughing. Word got back to Seagal, and Franken claimed the joke infuriated him. The man who once styled himself as untouchable on screen couldn't take being the butt of the joke in real life. For a star who wanted to be seen as mysterious, powerful, and above criticism, SNL was a brutal reminder. In comedy, ego is dead weight, and Seagal, with his stubborn refusal to laugh at himself, became a punchline he could never live down. For Steven Seagal, the troubles didn't end with awkward late-night comedy appearances or public feuds. A darker cloud has followed him for decades, one built on repeated accusations of sexual misconduct. Multiple sexual assault allegations have been directed at Steven Seagal. The pattern started surfacing in the early 90s, whispered around Hollywood but rarely making it to headlines. Actresses and assistants claimed Seagal used his star power to blur boundaries, often under the guise of casting calls or work opportunities. One former Warner Brothers employee, for instance, alleged that young women were warned not to be alone with him. Still, Seagal's career rolled on, the rumors tucked away behind his box office clout. But by 2010, the whispers erupted into something louder. Kaden Nguyen, hired as his personal assistant, accused him of keeping her virtually captive for 6 days, during which she claimed he repeatedly assaulted her. Nguyen's lawsuit didn't go far. It was eventually dismissed, possibly settled, but it cracked open the door. Other women began stepping forward, saying similar stories about Seagal's predatory behavior. Then came 2018, when the #MeToo movement pushed long-buried accounts back into the spotlight. Two women, Fabiola Daddis and Regina Simons, publicly accused Seagal of assaults that happened years earlier. Simons, who was just 18 and working as an extra on Deadly Ground, said Seagal lured her to what she thought was a rap party. Instead, she alleged he forced himself on her in his home. Daddis, meanwhile, described going to what she believed was an audition, only to be assaulted under false pretenses. Both women's accounts struck a chilling chord, fitting into a pattern that others had hinted at for more than 30 years. Yet legally, nothing stuck. Simon's case was shut down by California's statute of limitations. Daddis's claims, like many before hers, didn't lead to charges. To this day, Seagal has never been convicted of sexual misconduct. That technicality, however, hasn't erased the damage. His name now sits in the same breath as other Hollywood men whose careers unraveled under the weight of accusations. And while Seagal continues to reinvent himself abroad, posing with world leaders, releasing martial arts tapes, or even dabbling in politics, The stories of women who crossed his path remain a permanent stain on his legacy. For Steven Seagal, controversies weren't limited to his personal relationships or the long string of allegations against him. Even when it came to something as routine as press interviews, he managed to turn them into battlegrounds. And when the interviewer happened to be a woman, Seagal's disdain wasn't just obvious. It was explosive. What he calls female reporters. At one point, Seagal openly admitted that he only ever had a hard time with women during interviews, as if professionalism went out the window the moment a female reporter sat across from him. He didn't stop there. In one tirade, he dismissed women in the press as nothing more than a bunch of dirty woo. It was a statement so crude and dripping with contempt that it revealed exactly how little respect he had for women in positions of authority. This wasn't an isolated slip of the tongue either. Seagal had a reputation for being prickly with journalists in general, but with women, his hostility turned personal. Stories circulated of him brushing off their questions, belittling them mid-interview, or outright refusing to engage if he felt challenged. For a man who thrived on the image of discipline and control, his inability to handle female reporters without resorting to insults showed the cracks in that carefully curated facade. It also fed into a larger narrative. By the time these comments resurfaced, Seagal was already buried under a mountain of accusations about his treatment of women, on set, in casting rooms, and behind closed doors. His outbursts toward female reporters didn't just come across as unprofessional. They added fuel to the fire, painting a picture of a man whose disregard for women bled into every corner of his life. Instead of putting out the flames of his crumbling Hollywood image, Seagal's own words only fanned them. What should have been harmless interviews became proof of the same toxic arrogance that had followed him for decades. If Seagal's outbursts toward female reporters revealed his contempt, the stories from Hollywood sets painted something even darker, an unmistakable pattern of harassment. His harassment history. Take Jenny McCarthy, for instance. She recalled going in for an audition for Under Siege 2 back in the 90s. Expecting a normal read-through, she was blindsided when Seagal allegedly asked her to strip so he could see her naked body. McCarthy walked out humiliated and furious, later calling the experience one of the most unprofessional and disturbing moments of her career. And hers wasn't the only story. Other actresses remembered Seagal showing up uninvited in their trailers, standing there uncomfortably close, making sexual innuendos as if it were part of some twisted routine. One co-star described him silently watching her brush her teeth, then casually tossing out crude comments, turning a private moment into something invasive and deeply unsettling. Jenny McCarthy's story was disturbing enough, but it was only part of a bigger pattern. On Seagal's sets, tension always seemed to follow, and if his behavior toward women was predatory, his treatment of fellow actors could be downright hostile. He assaulted John Leguizamo. Take Executive Decision in 1996. By then, Seagal had a reputation for being difficult, but this moment really sealed it. On the very first day of shooting, he reportedly gathered the cast and crew, puffed out his chest, and declared in no uncertain terms that he was in charge. To most people, it sounded like ego on steroids. To John Leguizamo, his quick-witted co-star, it sounded hilarious. He couldn't help but laugh out loud. Big mistake. Seagal, apparently unable to tolerate even the slightest crack in his self-importance, stormed over to Leguizamo, and without warning drove his elbow into his chest so hard it knocked the wind out of him. Leguizamo later described being doubled over, gasping for breath, stunned that an A-list star had just assaulted him over a laugh. What could have been a funny behind-the-scenes story instead became another reminder of Seagal's thin skin and explosive temper. Here was a man who preached discipline and respect in martial arts, yet couldn't handle being the butt of a harmless chuckle. On set, that arrogance translated into a toxic environment where cast and crew learned quickly. You don't cross Steven Seagal, not even with a smile. And the irony? In Executive Decision, Seagal's character doesn't even make it past the first act. He's killed off in a shocking twist, but off-screen, His ego refused to die, and his co-stars were the ones left picking up the pieces of his outbursts. Seagal's explosive temper didn't stop with co-stars. It sometimes spilt over onto the stunt performers who literally risked their lives to make his films look believable. Most action stars understand the unspoken rule: hit hard on camera, but don't actually hurt the people who make the fight scenes possible. Seagal, according to several insiders, didn't always play by that rule. Seagal allegedly struck stunt performers. Stuntman Kane Hodder, famous for playing Jason Voorhees, hinted in an interview with Unrated magazine that Seagal had a habit of actually hitting stunt performers during shoots, though Hodder stopped short of outright accusation. Others in the industry were less subtle, describing Seagal as notoriously rough, often using real strikes where fake ones should have been enough. Michael Jai White, a fellow martial artist who starred alongside Seagal in 3 films, including Seagal's directorial debut On Deadly Ground, spoke candidly about the situation in an interview with DJ Vlad. White described Seagal as a unique situation when it came to striking stuntmen. While Seagal never laid hands on White during their fight scenes, the stunt teams around him were reportedly terrified of crossing him. On the sets, there was no real way to complain or push back without risking being written off, or worse. Seagal's tension with stunt performers wasn't just rumor either. Legendary stuntman and martial artist Gene LeBell allegedly had run-ins with him, with accounts suggesting that even highly experienced fighters found Seagal difficult to manage on set. He cultivated an image of invincibility and absolute control, but behind the camera, that aura often translated into intimidation and real, sometimes unnecessary violence. For a man who built his career on martial arts mastery, discipline, and the supposed honor of his craft, the reality was far messier. On screen, Seagal's fights looked flawless, controlled, and almost Zen-like. Off-screen, however, the people bringing that choreography to life were dealing with a very different Steven Seagal, a man whose temper made the set a minefield, and whose reputation in Hollywood became just as notorious as his martial arts skills. Seagal's reputation for being difficult didn't stop with stunt performers or co-stars. It even spilt over into rivalries with other action stars. One of the most famous feuds in the 90s, Hollywood, was with none other than Jean-Claude Van Damme. Seagal feuded with Jean-Claude Van Damme. Seagal and Van Damme had a lot in common: martial arts chops, big egos, and a flair for on-screen destruction. But when it came to box office numbers, Van Damme made Seagal look tiny. His films grossed a jaw-dropping $566 million, compared to Seagal's $18 million. Still, this wasn't about money. It was about pride, reputation, and proving who was the real martial arts king. The rivalry began in 1991 on the Arsenio Hall show, when Hall asked Seagal what he thought of Van Damme's martial arts skills and championship record. Seagal paused, then questioned JCVD's legitimacy. "I just promised all my mentors that I was going to be a good boy," he smirked. Pushed further, he added, "I think that it's a matter of opinion that he was a champion anywhere. I'm not being catty or anything. I wish the guy all the best. But there are an awful lot of people who say that that's not true." Van Damme was furious. He later bumped into Seagal at Planet Hollywood and confronted him, but Seagal brushed it off as a little professional rivalry. They shook hands, yet Van Damme wasn't willing to let it slide quietly. Over the years, he took shots at Seagal in interviews, describing him as very boring and mocking the way Seagal portrayed a stoic, macho fighter on screen. Things came to a head in 1997 at a Sylvester Stallone party in Miami. Van Damme, still irked, challenged Seagal to settle it in the backyard. Seagal, true to form, vanished. Van Damme chased him to a nightclub, only for Seagal to dodge again in what Stallone called a Houdini. The Hollywood legend speculated that Seagal's avoidance wasn't cowardice, it was calculation. Van Damme was simply too strong, and Seagal didn't want any smoke. Seagal addressed the feud years later on his reality show, Steven Seagal, Lawman, dismissing the idea of fighting Van Damme as like squashing an ant. Van Damme, meanwhile, jokingly suggested during a press tour for The Expendables 2 that Seagal should lose some weight so he can be a little faster. The biggest bombshell? Van Damme revealed that both had been offered $20 million to face off in Las Vegas, but Seagal declined. If the two had fought, Van Damme likely would have had the upper hand. Reports suggest Seagal feared his rival, and in martial arts, hesitation can be fatal. Van Damme's own reputation spoke volumes. During Bloodsport, he reportedly knocked co-star Bernard Mariano out cold, leaving him with 7 stitches, and the scene stayed in the final cut because it looked that good. Critically and commercially, Van Damme also wins hands down. Of Seagal's 50-plus movies, only 4 earned a fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, and 3 of those didn't even star him. Van Damme boasts 9 critically acclaimed films, with recent hits like The Bouncer and Kickboxer, Retaliation winning praise and making over $1 billion globally. Beyond the screen, he's inspired fighters like Scott Adkins, Nate Diaz, and Conor McGregor, influenced the creation of Mortal Kombat, and championed conservation and animal rights causes. In 2022, he was even appointed ambassador on the environment for the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Seagal, on the other hand, largely stepped back from mainstream Hollywood after the 90s, focusing on straight-to-video films. But he carved out a different path, performing the scores for most of his movies, releasing albums like Songs from the Crystal Cave and Mojo Priest, and investing in therapeutic oils and energy drinks. He's remained an environmentalist and animal rights advocate, but arguably, his most headline-grabbing move was being appointed Russia's special envoy to the United States in 2018. By 2023, Van Damme claimed the feud was ancient history. "I have no problem with Steven. When you're young, you want to be the macho man. If I saw him today, I'd have no problem," he told the Daily Mail. And yet, the saga between Seagal and Van Damme stands as a perfect snapshot of 90s action star Hollywood. Egos clashing, reputations on the line, and drama off-screen almost as explosive as the fights on screen. What do you think is the strangest thing about Steven Seagal? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also click on the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.